Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second meeting of the Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force and the first meeting in Baltimore City. My name is Bill Henry. I'm the Baltimore City Comptroller, and I have the honor of serving as the chair of this task force. I'm looking around to see if we are joined tonight by any elected officials other than the ones serving on the task force, and I am not seeing any, although I understand that may change later in the evening. Let's see. I want to first say this is both for task force members, for staff, and when we get to the point where we're taking public comment for any members of the public, please speak directly into the microphone. Some of the feedback problems come from when people are talking back here and they're trying to adjust the sound level so you can still be heard. So please, for those of you, and I'm deliberately not looking at the delegate, for those of you who are not used to holding a microphone in front of you and talking into it, really put your mouth unnaturally close to the microphone. It feels weird. You think it looks weird, but this is what you have to do to make sure that you can be properly heard. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Baltimore City Recreation and Parks Department for hosting us here at the brand new Middle Branch Fitness and Wellness Center. In the interest of safety, I want to point out that there are emergency exits there and there, and there are also regular exits there and there, the way you came in. Let's see, for sake of convenience, restrooms are located outside and down the hall. By the way, that's pretty much always true. The public can sign up for the opportunity to provide comment during the meeting or during the break between the task force discussion and public comment. For the sake of timing, all public comments will have a 2-minute time limit. However, I want to encourage you to send questions, comments, and testimony to the committee's email address, which is watergovernance@baltimorecity.gov. If you have a question tonight that we don't have the answer to right now off the tops of our heads, we will follow up on the email and post the answer to our website, which has a really long address, and you're better off Googling Baltimore Regional Water Task Force. The sign-up table is at the back of the room. You guys have the sign-up list over there on your table? Where is the sign-up? The sign-up table is outside this room? Okay. And this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the Baltimore County Facebook page. It will be posted on YouTube in the next day or so. Up on the screen, you can see tonight's agenda. We're going to have recap and follow-up from the first meeting. Then we're going to have roughly 45 minutes of consultant presentation and then 45 minutes of task force discussion. But as in the first meeting, those two sections will probably blend together a bit. Task force members are certainly allowed and perhaps encouraged to ask questions during the presentation. And the only limit we're putting on that is the total presentation and discussion time needs to be over by 7:45, at which point we will have a 15-minute bio break, and then we will take public comment from 8 p.m. to 8:45 p.m., at which point the task force will reconvene to take two votes. One will determine with which governance model that we want to continue to study, and the other vote, as described and discussed at the first meeting, will be how much we want to, or whether we want to, look at including stormwater in the scope of our work going forward. And like I said, those votes will be at the end of the meeting after public comment. I think that's all I have in terms of opening remarks. So I'm going to hand this over to committee staff to proceed with their presentation. By the way, the presentation was posted on our website earlier this week on Monday for anyone who wants to pull it up and follow it along easier at home. Going forward, the slides and agenda will always be on our website in advance so people can see beforehand what we're going to be talking about at each public meeting. So I guess I'll turn it over to Brian.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Brian Schell, and we'll just touch on the content of the future meetings as well. So this is the meeting number 2, where we'll be focusing with the consultant presentation on the governance models, and we'll be coming back in meeting number 3, where we will review the outcome of those governance model discussions, and then begin our preliminary fiscal analysis, which is a review of the as-is conditions for the existing status quo of the system, and then proceeding through to the final fiscal analysis and the summary and recommendation in the future. We're going to start off with some of our follow-ups that we committed to from meeting number 1, and I'll turn that over to my colleague Xavier, who's going to step us through some of those.
Thank you, Brian. I'll hold it. All right, good evening, everyone. So in terms of follow-ups, we identified 3, the first of which being confirming the scope of the task force charge. Can you all hear me, by the way? Is that fine? Okay. Confirming the scope of the task force charge, going over the cost allocation model, and the service delivery details as well. So there are certain follow-ups that are going to be addressed in future meetings, and specifically that's the level of state support to Baltimore's water and wastewater sector. That's the split between the in-house and outsourced work, as well as access the wholesale agreements, and additionally details on the process of truing up the cost allocation and the impact to capital costs over time as well. And then finally, just some comprehensive as-is information going over the utilities as it relates to capital costs. So those items are going to be addressed in a future meeting. In terms of the scope of the task force charge, to the question of whether the task force is expected to look at stormwater management practices, the scope of the current exercise includes water and wastewater systems only. So stormwater management, right, the diversion of rainwater and streams away from streets and properties conducted by Baltimore City and Baltimore County, that is not included under the scope of the task force, but we'll be voting on that today. So the task force will. And so in terms of just background on that, at the city level, DPW's plans review and inspection section has the authority from MDE, Maryland Department of the Environment, to operate the city's stormwater management program and erosion and sediment control program for all land disturbance activities. At the county level, the Department of Environmental Protection and Sustainability oversees stormwater management programs with assistance from the Department of Public Works and Transportation. In terms of the cost allocation from agreements, I think I'm going to turn that to my colleagues. Neil?
Good evening. This is Neil Callahan with WSP, and one of the questions I think that was raised at the last meeting had to do with the cost allocation methodologies. So I want to talk a little bit about that for water and sewer. For the sewer, the next slide. The cost allocation is based predominantly on volumetric contributions. And it starts with the 74 agreement that establishes the conditions for that for sharing O&M costs for the joint facilities. So in simple form, the county pays the city for the county share for anything involving transporting, pumping, treating, or disposing of county sewage, and the city pays the county kind of the converse, all based on a volumetric share. So all of the costs are at cost and include O&M, administration, supervision, and debt service. So the excuse me, the cost method is based on the development of a cost allocation model, and that model is prepared every year. It's a 30-year model, and I'm sorry, 40-year-old model, dates to the early 70s, and it is a spreadsheet model that is 29 pages and has quite a bit of factors and formulas in it. The model is prepared jointly by the city and the county, and each year it's agreed to get to what the cost shares by volume are for both water and sewer. So that is the fundamental basis embraced in both the 72 water and 74 wastewater agreement for allocating costs. The relative issues associated with the cost share have not been significantly disputed over time and generally are agreed to at this point in time based on the use of the CAM model. So who shares what costs are not generally a source of dispute or contention. The model itself has been described as archaic. It has factors in it that go back to what was in existence in 1972 or 74 that people don't fully understand why they're there or whether or not they are factual representations of the case that exist. They nonetheless are used. So there's a lot of issues with that, and in discussions with the city and county representatives, there's work to continue to improve the spreadsheet itself, but nonetheless, it's an archaic, formulation to come to the cost allocation. So, yes.
Question: Does the cost allocation, is it explicit on maintenance or ongoing costs? Is that the O&M? So I get the delivery, but in terms of what it costs to maintain an aging system, has there been any dispute around that?
That's kind of an individual cost elements. Quite honestly, at where we're at, I'm not aware of that, to be perfectly honest. I can tell you what the cost elements are. I intend to do that in a little bit, just to show you what's included.
I guess to clarify, I'm trying to get a sense of if the recoverable costs are adequate for the system. Has that kept pace over the course? That's really
well, that's the revenue side of this is a slightly different story. These are costs. So these are what share of the costs of running, the facilities are. So, Chair.
I'm going to sort of pile on with Mr. Davis because I get the difference between the revenue and the costs, but how you're calculating the costs is also important. Like in terms of for each jurisdiction, the appropriate share of the city's direct costs is the determining of that share, the complicated algorithm you were describing, or is that a simple formula that nobody has any concerns about?
I think there are some concerns, and for the details, they were described in the new gen report in section 5.2. It goes through very detailed analysis. There are, some problems ascribed to the model itself, but in general, I think there is at least a consensus or general agreement that it captures the respective costs and allocates them at least to whatever extent the agreement stipulated they be shared. I presume, and I think that's the subject of our fiscal analysis.
Okay.
Is that adequate? I don't have that information at this point. I know that it was described as there are not significant disagreements about the cost share allocation using the CAM model. Now, again, that's that last phrase, using the CAM model, is maybe a loaded phrase that we'll describe later. So most of the issues associated with the costs and the cost sharing, again, come up on the revenue side. So the CAM model looks at what the revenue should be to make sure that they are adequate to cover those costs. If there are hiccups in the billing, and since the city bills the water customers, and just to make it compounded, the county uses the water bills to generate its sewer bills, then the revenue variations can cause issues with annual settlements. Because that's the second key provision of the agreements, is you have to do the model, share the costs, look at the revenues to say they're going to be adequate, and then kind of settle up. Who owes who money? And what, who's responsible for the balances due? So there are years that the settle up said the county pays the city, and there may be years that the city collected more revenue and would pay the county. But that settle up has been, it has been a greatly kind of disputed issue over the history. I did want to check if you look at the New Gen report, it basically said that the settlements hadn't been paid for like 5 years. And so that's a pretty significant disagreement. But as of now, they're current, and there's a tendency of agreement. So it is working considerably better. And there is, again, no significant disagreement about the settlements, as I understand it. And again, that's what we've been told, and we will come in hopefully with the facts and figures to support that in the fiscal analysis that we're still working on. So that's the sewer allocation cost. The water allocation formula is certainly a little bit more complex. It's also in the CAM, and it breaks down to kind of looking at different classes of assets by either system volume, zonal volume if the assets are in one of the zones, actual expenses, unit costs, or percentages of accounts. So in principal part, there are, I think, 6 or 7 articles in the 1982 agreement that stipulate how the costs are allocated. And that is what's used in, again, the CAM model for the water side. So, and again, all of the costs would be applicable to the wholesale partners. So the cost allocation model is prepared annually. It's worked on by both parties to understand what it is. And the settlement is, that concludes the year, is at the end of the year by both parties. So that's the kind of still very summary level assessment of what the cost allocation and revenue recovery steps are under the agreements. Next slide. And this, I think, goes to Zape.
May have been asked by my colleague. I said this may have been asked by my colleague to my left, but did you speak to like the accuracy of like these settlements? And did you speak to also like, you said that it was disputed for, I guess, a 5-year period, but then you said that it was settled, it was shored up. Like, who is that deciding factor if the two jurisdictions or multiple jurisdictions can't agree to what that settlement looks like?
Essentially the two utilities, I don't know the specific level of authority in the utility to resolve that. But the two utilities have to work out the settlement. So if they disagree, and I don't recall off the top of my head what the dispute provisions are in the agreement. Presumptively, you go to court.
That's correct. We go to arbitration. That's how
Okay.
we have to resolve any of the disputes. I wouldn't say that they were disputed, more so the work just for some reason hadn't been getting done. So under the current administrations, both in the city and the county, there has been more of a partnership to work through those agreements. And we did work through and resolve the several years that were not done. And we're currently working on a current year. So we should be doing it every year. And that is the plan going forward, is to do it every year. I think one of the other points mentioned is how does this deal with the aging infrastructure? And that's part of this settle up process, is how much was spent on both sides, what was it spent on, where is the volume of water going? So for example, the way that the water zones are set up, we measure how much water went to each zone and then how much water was billed in that zone, because there's lost water in here. And then look at what are those revenues against how much was used and who paid for what was used. Was that volume going to county residents and there wasn't enough billed to cover it? And then that charge comes back to the county.
I just want to make sure that I heard you clear. So there's a third-party arbitrator process if it is a disagreement from that standpoint, but also the third party would be the one that confirms the accuracy, I guess, whenever they're making the judgment?
That's correct, if we went to arbitration. So the last time arbitration was done was in the 90s. So it's not routine that there is arbitration.
Okay, anything further at this time before we move to the next, out of the cost discussion?
Thank you, Brian. Okay, so in terms of the review of the service delivery model, I know that that's difficult to see on the screen. So stepping through that just kind of broadly, this graphic draws on some of the analysis that was conducted and provided through the Nugent report. So primarily, it identifies 7 key functions between the water and wastewater enterprises. So that's rate setting, customer billing, raw water supply and treatment, system maintenance and operations, development approval, water facility master planning, and finally CIP planning and implementation. So again, these are, I think, critical areas of how water and wastewater function between city and county. And it's important to just kind of have I think, a solid understanding of how that division of responsibility across these 7 areas is laid out. So, the city and county operate under an intermunicipal service agreement model, which you've heard about in the last meeting. The responsibility for, these major functions is primarily established and elaborated on in one of the various agreements, which we've talked about somewhat in the last meeting as well. So that's going back to 1945, 1972, and 1974. 72 primarily focused on the water side and 74 on the wastewater side. You'll notice that it's really not always a clean-cut responsibility model, particularly on the wastewater side. Overall, it's heavily a city-centric governance model, which is the current state of things. So the city is responsible for operation and maintenance of the water distribution system and related assets at the city and the district-wide level. On the county side, as it relates to the funding and the construction of water facilities that only benefit county customers, and the O&M as well for wastewater conveyance system. That's entirely the responsibility of the county. The county sets rates for water and wastewater for county customers, and on the back end, the city handles billing and customer service for all of the drinking water customers in the region. And, for wholesale customers, rates are set by those jurisdictions. So that's a little bit of an overview of, again, the division of responsibility for water and wastewater between the city and the county as things currently stand. I will turn it over to.
Okay, so that represents the conclusion of our follow-ups from meeting number 1 that we're going to be addressing in this meeting. As Xavier laid out, quite a few of the follow-ups that the task force and the public asked for in the last meeting are actually germane to meeting number 3, which is the as-is fiscal conditions. So that list of those 6 other follow-ups will be covered at that time. Yes, sir.
Before we transition to the next slide, on table.
Right into the mic.
Oh, sorry. On PowerPoint, page 12, under wastewater, the processing and the treatment of wastewater, I believe, is done by the city, which is not identified here on this table. I just want to note that for this panel. Oh, all right. Sorry. My apologies.
As the sun sets, the slides will be easier to see on the screen. So.
Mr. Chair, I did have a question. So when I'm looking at water, I'm looking at number 1 where it says rate setting, and then I'm looking at county established city implements.
Yeah,
and like this is
go ahead, sir.
super contentious sometimes when it's being explained from a public standpoint.
Yeah, so Xavier spoke to that is with respect to the county. So those rates are being set at, by the county for county customers. And then the city, of course, as you know, is responsible for the implementation and billing. Whereas the city, of course, sets the rates for city water customers.
But I've always been told that we're all paying the same amount. So is it that however you all measure water, that it comes out and then the county will set the rate, but then they supplement whatever costs? Like, do the city have one overall that they're charging the county, or am I looking at that totally wrong?
Lauren, do you want to respond to that one? I saw you reach for the mic.
Can I practice this? Because I get asked this question a lot, and so I want to see how right I am in terms of when I'm giving the answers. There are agreements that determine what bulk rate the city charges the county for water, and then those agreements determine how much we charge Baltimore County for water, but then Baltimore County has its own internal determination where they decide how much they're going to charge their residents. Is that accurate?
Yes, mostly. So the county has to do a cost of service study and figure out what it is costing us to use this water. Then we look at that. There's also the other thing that's very challenging to look at here is its different line items. There are different line items for county customers than there are for city customers. And one of those that I think we'll talk about maybe when we get to the stormwater vote is related to stormwater. So city customers have a stormwater line on their water bill that they pay. County customers do not have that. So there are some other things related to these bills that are not related to the water and wastewater system that at first glance, it looks like the city bill is higher. But when you really break things apart with what the cost is per unit of water and you take out some of these other numbers, they do come out to be much closer. It's also confusing because the city customers are billed monthly and the county customers are billed quarterly. So that gets confusing to look at when you're trying to compare apples to apples. But the county has to maintain solvency in our fund. So we have a separate fund, the Metropolitan District Fund, that is only used for water and sewer. That fund has to balance at the end of the day. There's no general funds involved in it. So if we're not receiving enough income from the sewer and water charges of our residents, that fund wouldn't be solvent.
So I'm gonna repeat my question. It's not about stormwater. It's not about wastewater. It's strictly, specifically about water. And to the comptroller's point, when he mentioned the bulk rate, I just want to make sure that the bulk rate that the county is being charged is equivalent to what our folks are being charged, because that's the question that we get asked all the time.
So that I would have to go back and look at exactly. I'm not sure how that item lines up between the two bills. But at the end of the day, like the county has to cover its charges. So
Would DPW want to wait? Because they're the ones that's making ultimately the bill. They're the ones that's telling the county what the bulk rate is going to be. I just want to confirm, especially for my constituents, that we get this question all the time, that the bulk rate is similar, equivalent to what the county is paying.
Yeah, Richard Luna, Interim Director, DPW. We could pull those numbers for you and pull that together as a follow-up item that we can submit to the task force, just to make sure we're confirming all the numbers are accurate and responding to that question.
I do think that this is something that we should follow. I think this is one of the more contentious issues that we have from our constituents. I thought it was a yes or no question. It doesn't sound like a yes or no question. So I do think that this is one of the things that we should follow up in a public manner from that standpoint, so that the constituents also.
Thank you, Senator, and we will definitely follow up with that, and that information will be shared with the task force members at the earliest possible time. What I would take this opportunity to wonder publicly about is the city gets to decide every year or three, depending on the recommendations that DPW brings to the Board of Estimates. The city gets to decide periodically how much it needs to charge in terms of its rates. It is unclear to me whether the existing agreements between the city and the county offer that level of annual or triannual flexibility. And so I suspect that we should make that a particular point for meeting 3 when we're discussing the financial aspects. If we can make sure that staff dig into how those agreements work in terms of what the required bulk rate between the counties is in relation to what is being charged to city residents by the city, and what flexibility, if any, there is to adjust that bulk rate based on the same reasons that we raise the rates for city customers. Patrick.
I had a quick question. Do the other counties that have agreements go through the same disputes and agreements, or? I know there's Howard County, Carroll, et cetera.
To the excuse me, to the extent that certainly the new gen people dug into the documentation, there's no indication that they have disputes.
Right, because they're not party to the same agreements that we've talked about, because they're wholesale customers. So they're not party to those dispute resolution processes that Ms. Buckler was speaking about. That's with respect to that agreement that's signed between the city and the county.
So just to follow up on Patrick's question, to be clear, the city is annually or triannually setting the rates for the other counties at the same time or at the same rate as what they're charging city accounts?
No.
Yes, okay. All right, thank you.
To the chair, are you referencing just Baltimore City and Baltimore County? Are you referencing the process by which the wholesale customers are being charged? I just want to make sure that we're clear on the distinction.
Well, I guess I understood Mr. Moran's question to be about the wholesale customers and whether or not they're able to participate in that dispute resolution process that Ms. Buckler described with respect to the county. And our answer was no, but there is a process for, as the chair explained, for setting those rates, which is the process used for establishing wholesale customer rates.
And thank you for that. And to the senator's point, I just want to make sure that as we look at the process for units for providing water for, and the charge of that for the city and for the county customers, that we also look at what we do that with our wholesale customers for raw and treated water, because they go through those same processes and need those capital improvements, especially on the city side, to be able to sustain that water in those areas as well. And I don't know what their burden is to share those costs for those capital improvements as well. So if you can provide that, that will be excellent.
Okay, we'll take that as one of the follow-ups for meeting 3. Anything further before we move into the next section?
Nope, it looks like you're good to go.
Okay, thank you, sir. All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk about what are the criteria for assessing the governance models as we now get into the heart of the intended topic for meeting 2, which is the governance models. And if you attended the prior meeting, this may seem familiar to you, but it's worth reemphasizing because the criteria that are in the House bill are the instructions to the task force for their charge. So it's worth kind of stepping through this, especially as it has shaped the way the subsequent materials that we'll go through as we review the 5 models have been prepared. House Bill 843 was passed by a majority vote of the General Assembly in April of 2023, and it authorized the formation of a task force to look into how water and wastewater are jointly managed, paid for, and delivered in the region. This legislation calls out the multiple original agreements that we have referenced in some of the follow-ups and that you heard us go into more detail about during the first meeting. The task force membership brings representatives from different stakeholder groups and also requires consultation with the Maryland Department of the Environment and the Maryland Environmental Service. And within House Bill 843, there is a methodology described to identify a future alternative governance model for the region. And in the first part of the bill, which is just a few pages long, so I think anyone who's interested in this process, should take a look at it. There are 8 criteria that are described and are shown on the screen here that have to be used by the task force in order to assess the governance models that are under consideration. And as we follow through these 8 criteria: management, operations, employee recruitment, retention and training, billing and collections, planning for capital improvements, emergency management, and rate stability for customers, that will become the first portion of this meeting. Not the first portion that we just did, perhaps it's the second portion now, but the first portion of the governance analysis. And we have performed, and my colleagues will share some more information about this process, but we have performed what is called a SWOT analysis. That's SWOT, to go through the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats associated with the 5 models against these 8 criteria. So that is the basis for that analysis being performed and how those criteria were selected that are part of that study. As we go through this process, there is sort of a funneling that happens, and the bill discusses the process of identifying alternative governance structures for the region. So this is some level of funneling from looking at multiple models, many models, And the bill suggests some level of funneling to alternative structures. I believe the term a range of models is used for the region. And the bill prescribes 6 criteria that are to be used in considering the models that are most suitable for the Baltimore region. The outcome, and as the chair indicated, there will be a vote called for of the task force at the end of this meeting. And the first of those votes is on the identifying that range of models. We, as the consultant, will provide a recommendation to the task force on the range of models that are most responsive to these criteria as prescribed by House Bill 843. And then the chair will ask the task force to take a vote. But again, these are the criteria that will then ultimately funnel as we move through this process together into the task force being able to select a model for the Baltimore region in subsequent meetings and after the analysis happens for the fiscal side. So the third portion, if you're following along in House Bill 843, are a set of criteria related to the fiscal implications. And we've talked and given a bit of a preview that the next 2 meetings are related to the fiscal criteria. These are the fiscal criteria on the screen. In our meeting number 3, will be focused on the as-is conditions. So what's the status of the utilities with respect to some of these items at present? We know it's important for the task force to understand the as-is conditions thoroughly. And as we move into the 4th meeting, we would be presenting on these criteria with respect to the fiscal implications of that range of models that the task force will vote on passing forward for further study this evening. So the first slide I showed was the first half of the governance things for today. The second slide was the second half for today. And then the criteria that you're seeing here are for the next 2 meetings, the first one being focused on the as-is, and then the final in-person meeting being focused on the alternative models. And I don't mean to belabor this, but I think that it's essential to just frame it in the context of what is in House Bill 843 so that we understand the charge that we're responding to as the consultant supporting the task force, and so that it makes a little more sense about why things are arranged the way that they are. Mr. Barr?
I just want to be clear so that I can absorb the information you're about to give us. Our vote, will it be on multiple models or will it be just on one model, or can you describe that? I just want to make sure as I'm taking in the information you're about to give us that I'm prepared to vote accordingly.
Sure. Mr. Chair, would you like me to address that, or would you?
Let me see if I can do it succinctly.
Okay.
There are 5 models.
Right.
They're going to suggest that we take this opportunity to narrow it to 3
Okay.
so that we can proceed with a more focused look.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Okay. Senator?
Thank you. I looked at slides 15, 16, and 17, and I'm in full agreement with what you all have on 15, 16, and when I get to 17, I just couldn't make the correlation of how pension liabilities come into the equation. Like, I know fire may get a different pension, police may get a different pension, but I didn't think that the folks that work at these respective facilities get a different pension than other city employees.
Well, the implication would be that you have right now at least two separate pension systems, right? And so some of the models reflect one of the models reflects moving towards a special district or authority utility model where utility employees that right now might be part of 2 separate pension programs would become part of perhaps a new one as part of a combined utility, if you will. And of course, the ongoing pension liabilities for existing employees would have to be considered as part of what's on the books.
I would just want to confirm on, and sort of following up on the senator's question, that in the course of WSP's research into the different models, if we were to move forward in continuing to talk about that, an authority, some type of separate entity, you would be able to describe examples of how in other places, when they created an authority where previously there had been individual or a separate jurisdiction, that there are historical examples to refer to on how you handle employee transitions.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further from the task force before we move to the next section?
Good evening. I'm Ron Hartman with WSP. Is that better? I'm going to introduce the models. We are going to talk about them more in greater depth later in the presentation. Our references for this, we believe the current model is actually C, the intermunicipal service agreement, and we'll talk some more about that. It's also important to understand that each one of these models is basically a construct. The way they are actually implemented is not pure. There's twists and turns in each one of them as they relate to the local circumstances and the local jurisdictions. For each one of these models, before I just quickly mention them, Brian talked about the SWOT model that we used. I don't know if you want to, I should spend another 30 seconds on that, but basically the SWOT analysis we did, to be clear, is essentially a quantitative look at each one of the models with respect to each one of the 8 criteria. So in the end, there were 40 separate analyses. And what a SWOT analysis is, which is a terrible name, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, you look at options, and in this case, the models, in an organized fashion from every possible angle to understand exactly what it means, what it presents to you, what the problems that could come with it. And that's the way we looked at it. In terms of the actual models, again, we will talk more about each one, but the 5 models we have worked with are the Memorandum of Understanding, which is basically a limited in scope way of often used to just begin negotiations. Sometimes it's not binding, and it's at a very high level. The second model is a cooperative. A cooperative is more commonly found in rural and remote areas where there is no formal utility to connect to. It's member-owned. C is an intermunicipal service agreement, and that's the one we believe most accurately encapsulates what exists in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. It maintains the current legal structure, and basically the utility works through that with agreements between the 2 or however many jurisdictions that get water that way. The wholesale service purchase agreement is our Model D, and that's essentially a utility that is providing water on a wholesale basis. In Baltimore, you provide wholesale water to some of the counties, so there's actually a kind of shade of that in the current model. And finally, the last one is special district. I'm sorry, I'm fighting with the microphone. The last one is a special district, which is an independent organization, or at least a semi-autonomous unit. Essentially, it would have a board that would be representative of the various entities that join into it that would control it, but it would be separate body from the jurisdictions it serves. With that, On the next slide, you get a sense of the, oh, I'm sorry,
If
questions?
you don't mind. Did I hear you right? Did you say you did a quantitative or qualitative?
Qualitative.
Okay, I thought you said
Oh,
quantitative.
sorry,
Thank you.
if I said that, I was mistaken. It's qualitative because much of this really doesn't lend itself to numbers and quantitative. It's qualitative. I have to look at the person. Uh, This slide basically gives you an idea of all the utilities we looked at. They all mostly fall into the models that we just described to you, and that we'll talk a little bit more about. Again, they each have a little bit of differences in terms of how they adjust to local conditions. We try to have a wide variety across the United States, north and south, including a couple of international models.
Excuse me, we have a question.
I'm just curious, the middle section of the country is pretty blank. Were there just not responsive models there, or what was the thinking behind that?
Sorry. I don't know if it was necessarily a lack of potential models to use. I think, as we talked about, a lot of the rural areas are going to be more cooperative focused. But like, we try to incorporate a few places like the Midwest, a couple of Missouri to kind of, in instances where we thought the city might be similar enough to Baltimore to warrant further analysis.
And we did want to, in response to some of the comments last time, we did try to broaden to focus on cities that may have a similar age as Baltimore, and most, outside of some of the ones that you see selected here, not larger utilities that have formed more recently in those places may be less applicable. Anything further at this time?
Hello, I'm Ananti, and I'll be taking you through two of the 5 models that are being considered today. The first one is Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU as it is sometimes called, which is labeled as Model A. So in the context of water and wastewater services, Memorandum of Understanding or MOUs serve a very specific purpose. They're either very narrow or limited in scope, specific to a certain project or an activity, or they serve as a starting point for further negotiations, in which case the subject addressed in the MOU is usually followed by another instrument, could be an intermunicipal agreement or a wholesale purchase agreement. And I'll provide 2 examples to really give you a flavor of what a document like an MOU can achieve, and how it is generally structured. So the first example is an MOU between the City of Santa Maria and the Nipomo Community Services District. So in this example, the Nipomo Community Services District wanted to buy water from the City of Santa Maria to supplement its water supply, and the both parties entered into an MOU. The MOU was a starting point of further negotiations. So it sort of laid out the intention of the parties, the basic terms and conditions, but it was very clear in that it laid out this is just to capture the intention of the parties. This does not create rights or obligations. Those will be addressed in a separate agreement. And so 4 years later, the MOU was followed by a wholesale purchase agreement. So this demonstrates the key takeaway that, an MOU could just be the starting point of negotiations, and is usually a precursor to another document or an agreement. So it could be one of many documents that relate to a certain partnership, relationship, or a transaction. The second example is an MOU between the Loudoun County and Loudoun Water. Now, this demonstrates the first point, that MOUs are generally limited in scope, address a very specific project or activity, and could be, set up as a really high-level document. So in this case, the county and the utility wanted to cooperate on certain capital projects in specific areas of the county. So the document is, set up as a mainly high-level terms of cooperation between the two entities, and it delineates the roles and responsibilities that each party would be responsible for with respect to those capital projects. So it wasn't sort of intended to govern the relationship between the two utilities in a comprehensive manner or in other areas of operations. Next. Oh, sure. Any questions at this point? The next model that we'll be looking at is.
I'm sorry, quick. Are we going to get into any of, I'm sorry, I guess that's on the SWOT. The SWOT when we'll actually break down.
Yes,
Okay.
that is
thank you.
correct. Okay, so the next model that we're looking at is the cooperatives model. We've called that model B. So yeah, cooperatives are generally non-profit, member-owned organizations. Specifically in the context of water and wastewater services, it's generally formed with the purpose of addressing a gap, which is, to provide centralized water treatment and distribution, as well as wastewater treatment and collection. So it addresses the lack of systems in, generally places in rural areas or remote areas that are unable to connect to existing utility networks. One thing to note about this model, all customers of the cooperative are members. Each member has voting power, and generally membership involves some kind of capital contribution. So customers who want to be members would need to, pay a capital contribution, sometimes called a patronage, and that becomes the basis for membership. There are over 3,000 water cooperatives across the US, and the purpose of these three examples is just to give you a flavor of what this could look like in practice, and specifically along three aspects. One is the purpose or the genesis for why the cooperative came into being. Secondly, the location. You'll notice that most of them are in remote or rural areas. Thirdly, the scale of operations, and I'll go into that a little bit when I describe each of these examples. So the first example is EJ Water Cooperative. It is based in rural Illinois, came about in 1989 to serve rural areas, residents, towns, and farms. It has since grown. It's one of the bigger cooperatives that we found, serves around 77,000 people with 14,000 members. It first started with water treatment and distribution, and has since diversified to wastewater collection and treatment as well. The second example is from New Mexico, Entrenosa Water, which serves a remote part of the East Mountains near Albuquerque, New Mexico, serves about 7,000 people, has been around for over 40 years. Similar genesis to provide services where none existed. The final example is of Bonita Springs, which is from Southwest Florida. Again, came about sometime in 1969, started with just 2,000 members to address poor water quality. So the purpose was to set up centralized water treatment and distribution. Started with 2,000 members or so, and now serves about 30,000. So just to sort of reiterate, there are some running themes in these examples. First of all, the purpose or genesis was to, fill a gap, that of, the need for centralized water treatment and distribution, wastewater collection and treatment. Second, they're generally in remote or rural areas that didn't have infrastructure in the first place. And needed to build something. And finally, the scale of operations, 70,000, 7,000, 30,000, smaller than what you would typically find in an urban water utility. Okay, I'll stop there. Any questions? Okay, I'll hand it over to my colleague David to take you through the other three models.
Thanks, Ananthi. So the first of the three models that I want to go over at this point is the intermunicipal agreements, which, as I believe Ron mentioned earlier, is presumably the most similar to what is already existing in Baltimore City and Baltimore County. So intermunicipal agreements work by essentially maintaining the existing legal structure of two or more separate water or wastewater utilities while upgrading existing agreements and incorporating an organizational structure and operational changes. Now, these agreements can allow for joint operation, maintenance of, or management of water infrastructure, or can even simply just outline the terms of engagement between two utilities. And so given how common this kind of structure is, we had some strong examples to work with in the region. Three that most informed our analysis at this point were the Blue Plains Agreement in the DC area, which includes large swaths of Maryland, as well as the Philadelphia Department of Water and its agreements with its region, and the agreement between the towns of Andover and North Reading in Massachusetts. These agreements, we believe, offer sufficiently different models for what an intermunicipal agreement can look like. Just to get into a little more specifics, the Blue Plains Agreement is a multilateral agreement with numerous signatories regarding the use of the Blue Plains treatment plant in Washington, D.C. It addresses capacity, treatment, biosolids management, and it's been updated twice since its inception nearly 40 years ago. I believe at this point it includes Washington, D.C., D.C. Water, WSSC Water, and some of the local counties. Philadelphia Department of Water is an example of a municipal agency that works multilaterally with nearby communities to provide service. For example, even though they're not in the same county as Philadelphia, it offers service to Bucks County and nearby Montgomery County. Then finally, the Andover North Reading Agreement in Massachusetts simply establishes the relationship between two similarly sized municipalities and clarifies their rights over the next 100 years to purchase water and utilize the infrastructure. Next slide, please. Unless there's any questions at this point. In terms of the wholesale water service agreements, those specifically pertain to bulk services, emphasizing the provision of large quantities of water between two or more utilities rather than the delivery of water to individual households. Notably, Baltimore already has implemented similar agreements with local counties to provide wholesale water, although it is not itself a wholesale water utility. These agreements are common in areas where one utility may have better access or more affordable access to water resources, or it just makes sense to have a third party providing the service. These agreements can also establish rules that govern the relationship and how these purchases will work. This is a relatively common model, so we had multiple options to analyze. Places like DC Water, the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority in the Boston area, and Tampa Bay Water, among others, provided good examples. For example, DC Water, it provides wholesale wastewater services with adjacent counties in both Maryland and Virginia for millions of people in the region. The Massachusetts Water Resource Authority supplies 60 different towns and cities in the Boston metro area with water and wastewater services, including the city of Boston itself. And Tampa Bay Water is a state-funded nonprofit district that provides wholesale water services to the Tampa Bay region. Beyond these examples, cities like Chicago, Louisville, Baltimore act in this capacity to provide wholesale services to nearby counties and cities, but again, are not necessarily governed as wholesale providers. And next slide, please. And then finally, for our fifth model, that's special districts and authorities. Special districts can be formed within a service area boundary to meet a specific purpose. A special district is a semi-autonomous entity, and policies and procedures are developed specifically to govern that new authority, generally reporting to a board. Special authorities have the authority to charge rates and fees and issue revenue bonds in return for the responsibility and obligation to render services. This is one of the more common models among the cities we've looked into. Some of the more influential systems we consider in our analysis, either due to their size or relevance to the Baltimore area, were WSSC Water and the Great Lakes Water Authority. WSSC Water has been serving Montgomery and Prince George's counties for over a century and coordinates water and wastewater in Maryland's two largest counties. The Great Lakes Water Authority is a regional utility around the Detroit area founded in 2014 that utilizes Detroit water and sewerage's infrastructure to provide service to Southeast Michigan. And at that point, unless there's any questions, I can move on to the next slide.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to move into now some discussion about the SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats model. And I see Mr. Moran.
I just had one question. In a lot of these structures, do the counties share any burden on the capital costs at all?
I think that I think that all of the agreements in principle have some mechanism to share capital costs. If it's a wholesale producer, the wholesale price would incorporate the capital costs. Certainly, and a special district and authority, it would be its capital cost. In terms of the intermunicipal district, your agreement has specific terms for sharing capital costs. So MOUs, in my experience, have generally been limited for a project to share capital costs. Typically, they are either an adjunct or something to add cost-sharing provisions into an existing framework. So all of them in some capacity have the capacity to address all of the costs, O&M, overhead, capital. So all of the models can do that. Doesn't make them all applicable.
Just one follow-up to that is, I noticed in Model A and Model B, those are all much smaller than what we're dealing with, right?
Generally.
Okay, so there were no comparables in those models?
There are generally no large-scale
examples.
To some extent. What's B? Yeah, the cooperative. I happen to have
Or the MOU.
I happen to have the experience with a large-scale cooperative and can tell you in detail why it failed. And it failed because of the management. Ananthi said that they have either a one-on-one management or participation by contribution of capital or monies. So, for example, in the current scenario, the city drives a lot of the water system. In a cooperative, if the county had the bigger customers, it may drive the cooperative. So those are some of the issues in terms of why that. Tampa Bay Water was a cooperative up till 1998, and they wrote a book about its failure, The Water Wars. And it had to do with the governance in that any member could stop any project from moving forward. And because of that, and faced with rapid growth, they just couldn't do anything.
One last follow-up on this, and then debt service, who's responsible for that?
Well, again, in each of the relationships, the debt service would be a component of the overall cost of service and what's agreed to be paid back and forth. So all of the components, in any utility, there's a cost of service study, what it takes to pay for all of our expenses. And they can generally be passed through any type of relationship.
Making it clearer for me anyway, as you were describing those two, but going to the third one, the intermunicipal, did you say that this was the one closest to our existing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So essentially, this would be a do-nothing option.
Well, this is the as-is option right now. When we are talking about what it might be in the future or what we would recommend, it would be modified. So what it is lacking, we would talk about what that would be to change it, to make it, function better or share costs differently. So there is the as-is case, which is what you have, and there will be a future intermunicipal case with a cost analysis for what it would cost to change it to something slightly different. We don't have that totally defined yet, but something different that would address the problems that have been exhibited currently to the best that we understand them. So we want to be very clear about that. When we talk about the future of looking at intermunicipal agreement, it's not what you have now. That's just as is. Okay, are we moving along? Another question, please.
My question is not about this subject. It's about what we're about to get into, the SWOT analysis. As we go through this, is there going to be a way to like say, the elements that you have under the strengths does one strength have more power than another strength? I mean, how are we going to make sense of the strengths and the weaknesses, opportunities and threats? They all equally the same.
Yeah, we have had multitudes of discussion on that point, and the problem with qualitative analysis it's always in the eye of the beholder to some extent. So we want to, the details of what the analysis is in the appendix. We simply want to say that the analysis was done, and I think there are some kind of very key facts about the two that we're suggesting we don't move forward with, that we are hopeful that you will understand why we're not making them go forward. We can't possibly go through the details of the SWOT analysis in the time. If there are specific questions, be happy to try to answer them, but we just want to suggest, there was quite a bit of time put into doing a qualitative analysis, looking at the models, looking at the respective strengths and weaknesses, and that took us to some of the point, but there are some other factors. Well, I'll tell you, one of the things about collaboratives, in addition to the kind of either one person, one vote, or other, is that in Maryland, collaboratives, the rates are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission. So we don't believe that would be a good model for the city and county. So that's one of the substantial reasons, a feature of them in Maryland that kind of drove home to us that that's probably not the best way to go. So, I'm cutting to the quick or cutting to the message here, but that's really, it wasn't so much the things in the SWOT analysis, but things that we encountered in conducting that analysis that drove the decision. MOUs in many cases they're not even binding, and they don't deal with governance in principal part. They deal with, I want you to sell me something, or I want you to give me a service, and we'll agree to pay or do this. They're fairly simplistic, and they don't generally deal with governance. So, that for us, in spite of whatever came out in the SWOT, was really the basis of saying, those are the two models we don't think merit further consideration and the detailed effort that will go into doing this for the task force. So, our intent was, simply to illustrate what some of the SWOT analysis look like, but we don't want to go through it. We don't think that's going to benefit the bigger crowd. Does that hopefully address your question? Okay. And I've let some of the cat out of the bag, so yeah, so we can move quickly if we want to jump the next two slides. We have looked at all of the 8 factors for all of the 5 models and listed them, but at the end there are some aspects or features that come out that deal with it. One of the evaluation criteria is just rate stability for customers. So there are strengths, weaknesses, threats, and opportunities associated with that model, associated with that. But they all what is it? The proof is in the pudding. It's how you implement them, not simply that they have those in general. Let's move to the next slide, please. So I believe this is kind of the summary. This is how we shortcut the SWOT analysis, just to kind of put it in some kind of summary fashion to suggest this is what the outcome. And again, the point that we're trying to get to is our recommendation about moving forward with 3 of the models that we think have merit for further consideration by the task force. So Yeah, if you have questions about the SWOT analysis and I'm able to.
Yeah.
The question from Senator.
I see two color codes here, so you may be leaning to something, but it's no legend or key to tell me what the color code is.
Correct. We have the next slide coming. You're making a great segue. So, yeah, but we debated taking it out because it again kind of was showing we were leaning. But where we are, we've conducted the SWOT model. We've looked at 30 utilities, and some of us have some familiarity with a great deal of them. We have looked at the 5 models, and our recommendation is to move forward with the consideration of the intermunicipal agreement, again, as may be modified, the wholesale agreement to the extent that it is feasible, and the independent authority or special district. So those are the 3 models that we're going to ask the task force to consider and at the chair's discretion or direction, vote for to allow us to move forward to focus our effort on those models. So again, kind of looking at what are the models. In the intermunicipal agreement, it is conceivable that you stay similar to the current legal structure with 2 separate entities. You can update the existing agreement. You can update the cost allocation model. There are a significant absence of any performance indicators in any of the agreements. There could be performance metrics or criteria put in relative to making sure that things happen that may or may not have happened. Again, these are all things you'll see or will get a chance to dive into under that. In the wholesale purchase agreement, would require kind of different relationships simply because the basics of this would be the county could be a wholesale customer of the city in providing water. Could simplify things on some levels, but it could make other things more complicated on other. And, we have to look at the physical feasibility of, is that practically possible? So that's option 2. And option 3, which has been, I think, on the table since the outset, is a special district or authority, a feasible option. And they can be formed collectively over the wider area. It would expand the rate base of the 2 discrete utilities, because the rate base would be the aggregate of the authority's jurisdictions, whatever that would be. And they have the authority to set rates and fees within the district and raise revenues and create indebtedness on the basis of their revenues. So there are a variety of differences from the basic relationship that exists, but there are pluses and minuses of a special authority. Ron and I are kind of old, aged people, consultants. Sorry, speak for yourself, he's telling me. But we've been through some of these, and I think Ron's statement to me was the biggest issue that you confront when you do these is kind of the home rule issue, because now you're changing the lines of command and control from city and county respectively to a perhaps semi-autonomous authority. So however that authority gets set up, whatever that governance model is, that is no longer a department of the city or a department of the county. It is a joint authority that would represent it and maybe the wholesale customers. So that's a distinct change, and change is difficult to encounter or difficult to do. Yes.
So I get the subtleness of the three options, but I guess I got some subtle questions. If you can dig into the wholesale agreement, because I understand C, I understand E, but I was a little bit, I didn't make the correlation between D. And when you dig into D, Model D, can you also explain the difference between wholesale agreement and like privatization, which we talked about in the first meeting, because I'm not understanding it.
Well, I hopefully can clear up the last one. Privatization and wholesale agreements have no general relationship to one another at all. The wholesale agreements that we're envisioning in this instance are where, as opposed to be a joint participant running and paying for jointly used facilities at cost, one, let's say the county, for example, simply becomes a purchaser of water. So it purchases water on a volumetric basis at some set of pre-delivered or some set of designated point of connections and pays a unit cost for that water, period. The relationship deals with some of the same issues of, okay, if I'm just going to pay for a unit cost of water, the city would in turn have to have some assurances that the county's going to take at least some amount of the water and not take too much of the water, and also engage in some element of discussions about how much water I would need 5 years or 10 years from now. But the nature of the relationship is just, I'm buying a commodity.
So define, when I see the comment, responsibility for water transferred to outside entity. Give me an example of who the outside entity is.
I'll give you a case that I do a great deal of work with a utility, Tampa Bay Water in Florida. It's a wholesale regional utility. It creates water, sells it to Hillsborough County, Pasco County, and Pinellas County, and 3 cities. That's its customers, has 6 customers.
This isn't my subject matter expertise, which is why I'm asking these questions. So when you describe that, that sounds more like the special district or the authority versus
I'm
so
trying to
Baltimore
make
City would be the outside entity right now. Like they're the ones that administer.
No, Baltimore County would be the water producer, so they would produce the water, and I'm going to stay to the water because it's a little simpler.
Senator, you're going to need to talk closer to the microphone. They're having
Okay.
trouble hearing you.
Apologies.
Yeah, so Baltimore City would be the water producer, and the customer would be Baltimore County. I mean, this is a hypothetical. I'm not saying it has to be this way, but it probably would be. And so the city and the county would have an agreement, just say, I'm going to sell you X amount of water at a unit price. And that's the fundamental basis of the relationship, other than economics and longer term planning issues. Yeah, I mean, it's the same relationship at Howard County. It's just, would it be feasible to have the county kind of withdraw to that level of engagement?
I would just say, I would lean in, and I wholeheartedly understand now. So I would lean in and say words are important.
Sure.
So when you put responsibility of water transferred to outside entity, I think that it wouldn't transfer, it would stay with Baltimore City because we're the ones that administer the water to Howard County and the other jurisdictions right now.
Yes. Yeah.
Excuse me, Senator, where are you seeing responsibility transferred to outside entity? I think
I'm
on
looking
the wrong
at slide number 26, row number D, threat.
page. Okay. Yep. I'm going to echo your concerns that words are important.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That's also a compliment to the senator, because I believe that it's 2-point font, and I can't clearly read that without putting the specs. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Any other questions?
Yes, excuse me, Mr. Chair, this is more of a procedural issue on the upcoming vote.
Yes.
But does it make sense, I know that, appreciate the consultant has narrowed this to 3 options, but does it make sense in our vote to even narrow it further so that we can be even more focused after we hear these arguments about the different options?
I would be happy to entertain motions if the task force feels like it has ruled out more than 2 of the 5 options, then that would certainly be a motion that any task force member could make. I have to admit, I was going to ask, since you did make the point of saying that option C or model C, the intermunicipal service agreements, is pretty much what we have now. I was a little curious, and then you did start to answer the question in my head. I was a little curious of how we could recommend that without recommending that we stick with the status quo and without getting into the weeds of actually renegotiating all of the various intermunicipal agreements. Like, how could we recommend at the sort of 30,000 foot level that we do what we're doing now, but differently in a way that was going to make everybody happy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as we move forward and start talking about these, we have to start defining what the new models would look like and what features and attributes they would have. And you're right, we're not going to get to them in detail, but I think we get to them and are able to say, this is the direction that things need to go. It needs to fix this. It needs to have this type of feature or accomplish this objective relative to the exhibits in the cost sharing, or maybe redo the cost sharing. I mean, as I said, we have not mapped out all of that yet, but that's kind of our task to support you to say, here's the changes. Here's what you need to consider looking at to say, yep, we think that needs to change. And that would constitute redoing the agreements in some part.
Mr. Barr?
Mr. Chair, if it's appropriate, I would like to make a motion that the task force consider narrowing even further in its vote.
Let's hold off on the motions until we're going to do the voting session after public comment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I ask one more, or make one more comment. Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, recognizing me. When I look at DC Water under the wholesale service purchase agreements, I first wonder whether or not they should be a part of the special district, because I know they have agreements to process wastewater for all these jurisdictions, but they were a part of DC government before, and then the original way that they got set apart was because they, wanted to set up an independent authority. So I'm wondering whether or not they're both, or initially even.
I think the wholesale purchase agreement was specifically for the Blue Plains agreement. Is that right?
Right. But to them as a utility, they are really independent authority.
Yeah, they are. They're included in our list that we've put together. That'll be part of the report. With respect to that, we just wanted to use them as an example for the Blue Plains agreement as a wholesale agreement.
So you used them as an example for C, D, and E.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, that's one of the,
Well, technically, they're not listed with their logos on E, but that's what they are.
Yeah,
So
and wholesalers, in terms of their legal authority and structure, can be a regional authority, could be a cooperative, could be a city department. All of them do resale or wholesale, or could do wholesale. So this is one of the kind of the nuances of, is it governance or is it the form of
think
kind of
you're-
rates and revenues and operational issues.
I think you're adding fuel to Mr. Barr's fire.
Mr. Chair.
Actually, Lauren?
Neil, when you were talking about the special district option, you mentioned something along the lines of it expands the base of customers. Can you talk about how that is or why that is or what?
Yeah, I probably, I'm not sure whether I stated that correctly. You have a customer base, but each utility now has, the city has its customers per se, the county has its customers. The unified authority or the special district now has a rate base that is all of them. So to the extent that the city may have individual expenses that's it's bearing and the county has individual expenses that it's bearing, that's one of the areas, certainly expanding rate base and looking at, whether there's efficiencies in a unified system are kind of the emphasis of there. So it isn't suddenly we're going to grow more people. It's simply that the rate base is larger to support the one body.
Mr. Chair, as you may know, Ms. Keisha Powell, General Manager and CEO of WSSC Water, was unexpectedly unable to be here, but she is participating remotely and has sent some questions to me and has asked that I read them, which may sound like me answering my own questions, but would it be all right if we introduce some of those for the benefit of the task force members and the public?
That would be fine. Do not feel obliged to try to do them in Ms. Powell's voice.
Okay.
You can use your own
would not do
voice
her justice.
for both the questions and the answers.
I'm sorry to have to be looking at the phone to read these, but one of the distinctions was, and a suggestion for meeting number 3 was to explain rate setting from both a retail and wholesale customer perspective. County residents are considered either retail customers or the county is a wholesale and then recovers the rates via retail. And our perspective on that was that is very germane to meeting number 3 as we understand the as-is conditions from a fiscal perspective for these two utilities. So our plan is to address that at that time. Ms. Powell had a comment with respect to Detroit and Great Lakes Water Authority, and we have reflected them, as you saw, in the discussion of the examples. They are on our map. They are a utility that we are familiar with, and that we have had some discussions in the past with, and as part of what will be further studied, in the report, their experiences at those utilities.
Yeah, I mean, just as to the Great Lakes utility, this is Neil Callahan again. The Great Lakes Authority is an authority, a special district created with 3.8 million customers, and it provides water and wastewater services to its customers generally. It uses the city of Detroit's assets to perform those services and has a lease agreement with the city that pays the city, I believe it's in the order of $50 million a year, lease payment to run or to assume the responsibility or pay for the use of the agreement. It's termed a facility use agreement. You'll hear that term again. So it is just a somewhat different relationship, but again, talking about arriving at a larger rate base of customers, 3.8 million customers that they provide services to, and using the city's assets. So the city still owns them, but the Great Lakes Utility or Water Authority runs them and has the responsibility to improve them.
Ms. Powell has also made a statement that it may be helpful to distinguish between the basis or form of the agreement and then the governance structure for implementation of the agreement. And I think that came in prior to some of the discussion that we had, but I think that is a good point. There is one more. She was asking that in addition to the SWOT analysis that we've presented, does the consultant have a profile for the utilities that were evaluated for each and those in the map, so that we can understand the alignment and scale of the operation? And the answer is yes. We have looked at, for each of the utilities that are on the map, how do they set rates? What is their form of governance? And that is part of what will be part of the ultimate report. But it's infeasible to present for the number of utilities on the map during a meeting of the time allotted. And there was a final point from Ms. Powell, which is making a distinction between the agreement and structure, because, for instance, under the wholesale model, there could be a privatized entity that is working on that. And I think that we kind of stepped through that with respect to the senator's question and Mr. Moran's about that's not the intent of the wholesale model as it's being considered here. And I think that's all from Ms. Powell right now.
Any other questions? Oh, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the consultant, as far as Model A through E, what are some of the timing considerations? So if I'm looking at the SWOT analysis for Model E, Special District and Authority, it mentions long-term planning subject to policy changes. I'm assuming that model may take longer. What are some of the timelines associated with each model for implementation, if you will? So, for example, Model A may take potentially 1 or 2 years. Model E may take, longer because there's a lot more considerations. Could you speak to the timing of implementation, potential timing of implementation for each model?
There are, timing is something controlled by the participants. So it could go very fast, or let's say relatively fast, or it could go and take a long time. I'm not sure I see a material distinction in time. I may shade that changing the relationship or renegotiating elements of the intermunicipal agreement are going to be time consuming. So the parties have got to come together. There's technical support. There's probably legal support. There's financial support. There's maybe bond counsels involved. So it's not a simple matter of, yeah, we get together in a couple of weeks and do something. So, it's not a quick thing. I've been through one, and it took the better part of a year. Now, going through an authority is probably more radical. And again, it depends on, the commitment and the level of willingness, political will to do it. But it could be done in the similar time frame, but it would be one significant effort, because there is virtually almost every touch point of every function in the utility that has to be kind of considered, evaluated, mapped. The people have to be, mapped and worked out, and all of the rates and things and all of the finances have to be worked out. So it's a more substantial hill to climb, but I'm not sure it's a substantially different time frame. So we're not talking weeks. We're talking many months to years. That's just my experience. Ron,
Actually, before you turn it over to Ron, I'm going to stop and note the clock here, because after this slide, there are 4 more substantive slides that we have. And I know we had advanced one more, but then we went backwards. And I just want to call attention to the fact that we are 3 minutes from when we're supposed to be done with discussion. So what I would like to ask is if we can go through the remaining substantive slides as quickly as possible, holding questions on any of them until the end of all of them. If the task force would then like to continue discussion into the break time, that's fine, but I'd like to get the slides out of the way first so that we are aware of how much time we're using with questions.
Yeah, I can, and they're kind of recapping many of the things that we talked about. So intermunicipal service agreements, similar to what you have, the governance in principle part could stay the same. It could be an option to be modified, but it should stay the same. The financing would be similar to the parties' responsibilities now. There's certainly some opportunities to improve the coordination on capital planning. There could be efficiency gains by different configuration of some of the functions. There are, some decision-making processes are laid out. They could be augmented in the future case. Going next, please. In the wholesale agreement, this says there is no significant change to governance. I'm going to suggest there is. That because if there is a wholesale customer, they're fundamentally a little bit more disengaged from governance than the wholesale supplier. Wholesale supplier runs the show. The wholesale buyer is just buying a commodity. So that would be different. Financing would be split. Supply planning could be easier. There could be efficiency gains depending on all the functions work out. And it certainly can be laid out in agreement. Next slide. Special authority district, this would very much significantly change governance and how decisions get made. There are conceivably cost savings from economies of scale, pool financial risk. Those, have to be worked out. The fact that one entity would do all of the capital planning certainly resolves any interagency discussions, dialogues through that. There could be future gains through, more direct planned expansion and financing, and there can be, clearly laid out decision process for the boards. So the board would be set up for the policy, and there could be all kinds of things produced for SOPs and procedures. So those are kind of the real quick, sketched pieces of, not sketchy, sketched pieces of the three different governance models that we're suggesting or recommending the board consider in its vote.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any remaining questions from the task force on those last couple of slides? And if not, do we have any remaining questions that we need to give to staff before we break heading into public comment?
Chair?
Yes.
A quick question on the motion, Mr. Barr's motion. Is that going to be after the break?
That's going to be after public comment.
After public.
So we've got the break will take us until 8 o'clock. Then we will take public comment from 8 o'clock to either 8:45 or when public comment is done, if public comment is done sooner. And then at 8:45, we will return to task force discussion and we will take motions on the votes before us for the evening. And seeing no other questions, we are going to, I'm sorry, Doctor?
Just a quick one on the wholesale service purchase agreement. It wasn't clear to me whether the city currently sells water wholesale now.
Yeah.
So my point would be then that the wholesale agreement could be a component of either of the other options potentially.
I think the distinction we're trying to make is that, they can exist at the same time and in different permutations. What we're trying to describe is the relationship that we now refer to as between the city and the county. And so it would be changing that relationship to that model, understanding that the city or the utility may still be a wholesale seller of water to some number of entities.
Delegate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up, and maybe you explained this with respect to the wholesale agreement relationship. I understand you're saying potentially with respect to water, that hypothetically could be a new relationship. What about wastewater?
Well, it still in principle could be applied to wastewater. The question is, are the wastewater systems so interconnected that it remains feasible? So that's one of the things that has to be determined. That's what's initially been reported to us, that it may not be feasible because the systems are too interrelated and too interdependent, so you can't define the wholesale point of delivery. So that's one of the factors that will have to come out in the evaluation.
All right, I'm sweeping the table one last time and seeing no one reaching for the microphone or their neighbor's microphone. I'm going to say it's 7:49. We're going to take a break until 8 p.m. Please avail yourself of the water and wastewater systems, and we will be back here. And I ask task force members to please be in your chairs by 8 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Time.
Okay. That's great. Oh, well, let's,
Check 1, 2. Mic check 1, 2.
okay, well, we still have some public here, though we lost some of the ones that were on the other side. Where? Public. Oh, from, really? Okay. All right. So front and center, if you're interested in testifying and you have signed up, we have 4 people signed up to testify during public comment. We have Ken Brown Lane, Shirley Wiley, Andrew Hinz, and Jomar Lloyd. If okay, of those people, if you're here, raise your hand. Hey, there we go. I was like, okay, that's right. You moved over from the other side. That's right, because of the sun. All right. Okay. So, Ken Brown Lane? No. Shirley Wiley? No. Andrew Hinz? Come on up.
Hello. Thank you for letting me comment. I would like to bring up the issue of sewage backups. And I'm sure most of you know all of this, but for those of you who don't, with the current consent decree back in about 2018, EPA and MDE directed the city to address sewage backups that were happening because of city infrastructure. The city attempted to do that with a reimbursement program that was inequitable and did not work, and has decided, I believe, to institute or make a pilot program to on-the-spot reimburse people permanent. However, the city, for reasons that are unfathomable to me as a resident and taxpayer, has decided to limit that on-the-spot remediation to instances that only occur during wet weather. And this affects thousands of people, and 80% of those affected have their sewage backups in dry weather, which the city refuses to accept, even though both the EPA and MDE are telling the city that they are required to do this. As a resident and taxpayer, this makes no sense, and my fundamental comment to you all is to whatever governance model is selected, please don't allow this type of abusive behavior. I don't understand if it's somebody at a department level trying to avoid costs, if it's a problem with the spreadsheet you all are talking about, or why anybody would come to the conclusion that that is a way to treat customers or human beings is unfathomable to me. I would suggest that perhaps part of the task force, if you solve that issue through the model that you choose, sort of make it a case study. And if you solve that issue, then maybe you're picking the right set of model or combination of models, as it seems like you're entertaining. So hopefully I only took 2 minutes, but thanks so much for letting me bring this issue up. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Also, have you had a chance to talk to, Mr. Enns, have you had a chance to talk to any of the folks at the DPW table about your specific concerns?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, I'm just saying that's one of the reasons they're there, is if people have concerns about current operations, because I appreciate you making the link of what you're doing for the governance model, but if you have immediate concerns about operational matters, please share them with DPW tonight.
Yeah, I think they're pretty well aware of this issue. And I myself personally, to be honest with you, have never had my city basement have a sewage backup. But I do believe that governance should be human-centered, citizen-centered. And it baffles me that we wonder why people are leaving the city when we treat people this way that have sewage backups that are caused by the city. And then we wonder why people are leaving the city. I'm a taxpayer. I want people to move into the city so that over time my taxes are reduced. And this is not the way to go about it. It's exactly the opposite way to go about attracting more people to our fair city. Thanks.
Understood. Thank you. Mr. Lloyd?
Good evening. Can you hear me through my mask? All right, good evening. My name is Jomar Lloyd. I'm an organizer with Food and Water Watch, representing over 10,000 members in the Baltimore City area. While we've been assured multiple times that the task force does not intend to recommend the privatization of Baltimore's water system, there is still the matter of what happens after a recommendation is made. Again, we are urging the task force and the consultant to conduct the necessary racial and economic equity analysis to ensure this recommendation will not negatively affect the city's most vulnerable and underserved communities. We also believe it's irresponsible to make a recommendation without conducting the proper legal analysis and if it is possible for the task force to defend water protections meant to benefit these communities, such as the Water Affordability Program and ban on privatization after a recommendation is made. This was the case in Tampa, where the Water Authority was created, then moved to privatize water treatment to Veolia, the world's largest water privatizer. Without conducting proper due diligence, any recommendation made, which will supersede the city's autonomy over its water, threatens Baltimoreans' access to their water, a human right and, more importantly, a need. While this task force is looking to propel Baltimore's water system into the future, losing protections won through the Water Affordability and Equity Act and ballot question E of 2018 could regress Baltimore back into a time where homes were seized over unpaid water bills and struggling families left without access to one of our most precious resources. Lastly, we urge the task force to keep interpermissible service agreements under consideration until further study can be conducted in accordance with the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public who wish to testify who did not have their names called? All right, seeing none, I'm gonna take a page out of Brian's book. I was sent a copy. Actually, let me ask, and maybe I just missed it. Did task force members get a copy of the resolution that the Baltimore City Council passed on Monday night concerning the input that they wanted to provide to the task force? Did they not send a copy of it to you? Okay. Well, they sent a copy to me. And so I am going to pull that up, if you will bear with me. Here we go. Okay. Oh, yeah, this is going to be a little tough. Give me a second here. Well, it's more finding it inside this very long. Yeah, I think that was.
Are you looking to read the resolution?
I was looking to read the resolution because I had encouraged the council to have someone come and testify, and apparently that didn't work. But they did send a copy of the.
Yeah. So do you need it to read from, or?
I do. Yeah, I was trying to look it up to read from it. I thought it would be easier to pull up than it was. Let's see. I even put on the spectacles and everything.
I can bring you my computer. It was sent while we were.
Oh, they did send it. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. So on Monday evening, the Baltimore City Council adopted the following resolution for the purpose of urging the Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force to include the City Council in the task force's deliberations and to consider stormwater management, equity, and fair representation for Baltimore City on the board of any potential new governance structure. I'm not gonna, well, okay. I'm trying to decide whether to read the recitals or just read the resolution, but I think the recitals are where the meat of this is. So on September 27th, 2023, the Public Safety and Government Operations Committee held a hearing on City Council Bill 23-0182R, informational hearing, Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force. This resolution calls for an oversight hearing to understand the work of the task force. During that hearing, it was clear that the work of the task force does not include four very important considerations. The council is calling on the task force to include these items in their deliberations and recommendations. Stormwater. Any conversation regarding regional water must include stormwater management and planning. Baltimore City has experienced monumental rainstorms in recent years and is planning significant infrastructure projects to mitigate the impacts of flooding. While the analysis to establish the right solution to the flooding includes all water coming into the area, these projects will not be successful if there isn't a regional approach to planning and management of stormwater at a regional level. Legal boundaries between counties have no bearing on stormwater flow. Stormwater from Baltimore County inevitably flows into Baltimore City and has devastating impacts on our neighborhoods, causing floods, sewer overflows, and sewage leaks in the basement of homeowners. A regional approach to stormwater is the most effective way to address this growing problem. Equity. Equity should be the center of the deliberations and conversation about water systems and delivery. Baltimore residents pay more than Baltimore County residents for the right to have clean drinking water delivered efficiently to their homes. Conversations about leadership of the new structure, water delivery, rates, and service options must include ensuring that our majority Black and increasingly diverse community are not disproportionately bearing the fiscal burden of our aging water system. All customers must pay their fair share while allowing for affordability programs for those who need them. Majority Baltimore City votes. If a new regional governance structure is established, Baltimore City must have the majority of votes on the board. It is only fair that Baltimore City residents make up the majority of the board. And finally, involvement of the City Council. The Baltimore City Council has concerns about the lack of engagement with elected officials in Baltimore City. If Baltimore City is being asked to approve a new system, elected officials should be included in the deliberations and decision-making related to the recommendations. The Baltimore City Council urges the Baltimore Regional Water Governance Task Force to engage the public and this body in its discussions and deliberations. And then the rest is and now be it further resolved that a copy be sent to and such. So Brian, thank you very much for this. And thank you to the rest of the members of the task force for indulging me in sharing with all of you the words and sentiments of the City Council on this matter. I did explain to them at the hearing last week that the composition of the task force was not designed apparently to accommodate the local governments other than having the executives be given the opportunity to name people to the task force. I pointed out that there are only 3 elected officials on this task force of 13, and none of them are local council members of any of the jurisdictions that are involved. But I also cannot deny that Baltimore City is unique in terms of this conversation in that Baltimore City actually owns the water and wastewater system that we're here talking about and trying to figure out how to run efficiently, effectively, and hopefully equitably. If we have no more public testimony, then I believe we can cut back to task force discussion quite a bit early. And so I'm going to jump now back to task force discussion, where we will be taking votes on 2 items. One is the narrowing of the governance models that we will continue to consider. And the other is if so, how we will consider stormwater in the continued deliberations and eventual recommendation of the task force. So I think we'll go in that order. And before I take a motion from the task force members, would somebody from WSP like to very succinctly state their recommendation to the task force? And then task force members, I will be looking for someone to make a motion, either accepting the recommendation or altering the recommendation, and then we'll look for a second.
Sure. I do have a task force member comment from Ms. Powell, if I may. Her request was to please distinguish between agreement and governance structure. Documents in the meeting reference agreements, but when talking about the relationship between the city and county, we are really talking about the structure that will govern multiple types of agreements, which I think is a discussion that kind of came to light as well during our subsequent, before the break, but I did want to make sure to read her comments.
During the break, I was able to get some more details on the city's billing line items versus the county billing lines items and the rates. So this is, I know, a topic of conversation that we were going to table to get more information on, but since I have it, I'll share it with the group. So the county in a water bill has one line item for the consumption of water. That rate is different than the consumption of water charge on a city bill. The rates are determined by the individual jurisdictions based on the CAM model. So that's the cost allocation model that takes into account the operation and the maintenance of the system, the capital cost, the actual cost, the volume of water consumed within the different jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction has to be able to be solvent with those amounts. So there are items that are approved to be done in the CAM model. I can't speak to what happens on the city side to determine the rate above and beyond that, and to determine the other line items that the city bill has. So the county bill just has that consumption charge, which is less than the city bill's rate, but the rate is determined by the city for city customers, not by the county. And then the other line items that appear on a city customer's bill are determined by the city, and they do not appear on county bills. I would have to assume that those items are not part of the CAM, the cost allocation model, and what is shared between the jurisdictions. So I think the follow-up would be more detail from Baltimore City on what those items are that are not part of the cost allocation model.
Senator, did that address your concerns? Because I see a hint of a smile on your face.
No, it didn't address the concerns. It actually brings about more questions. I
was afraid it was that kind of smile. Okay.
Yeah. I think that there is going to become a point in these meetings that DPW is going to have to articulate why the difference is from a county bill to a city bill. I think that that is like one of the most contentious parts within our respective residents. And I think that it should be spoken to under this piece. There's a number of things to speak to billing. And I think that this is something that the consultant groups should be able to kind of ensure the accuracy of the statements that's being made by DPW to make sure that our constituents feel confident in the response that they get back.
So if I could respond to that for a second, I hear what you're saying, and the way I'm visualizing this, Ms. Buckler, when you were looking at a copy of a line item bill, like there is a water consumption charge that city residents pay where there's a certain amount per cubic foot that we pay. Like there's a basic number. And what I think the senator is looking for, and I know I'm looking for, is there is probably a cubic foot number per cubic foot number. No, not that shows up on a county bill. There is probably a cubic foot number that the county pays the city. That's okay. So the fact that that's not an immediate yes shows that this is what we're going to need. We are going to need somebody who can graphically explain how the cubic foot number that a city resident pays lines up with the number, the per cubic foot cost of water that Baltimore County pays. And I'm happy to acknowledge it's probably not easy and it's probably not simple, but I also am 100% convinced that it is something that is calculable. And that is what I think we want to see is if you take all of the various adjustments, you know, where we're taking out this for the work that you did here, and we're taking out this for that, and adding this, what is the equivalent of the per cubic foot price that Baltimore City is charging Baltimore County as a whole compared to what we charge individual residents in the city individually? So that's what I think we're asking DPW or WSP in some combination to do for us. That
I believe we owe it to our constituents.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
May I, Mr. Chair? Yeah, we're in complete alignment. This is part of what we are covering in meeting number 3. I live in the city. I actually scanned in my city water bill, and it's with our fiscal team, and one of our colleagues who lives in the county scanned in their county water bill. And we are absolutely, this is on the slate for meeting number 3 to present this graphically and step through it. We're all on the same page.
Meeting number 3 is going to be incredible. Like for those of you watching at home, meeting number 3 is going to be great. But I will also say that just to make sure that I've said this very clearly, I personally am not tremendously interested in seeing the lineup of a city bill and a county bill.
Correct.
Because of all of the different ways that it is handled in the 2 jurisdictions. What I want to see is the difference between the city bill and what we bill the county.
Correct, and that's part of this too.
Okay.
Both customer focused and from the perspective of the utilities.
Any other questions or comments relating to the billing issues? Because if not, I'm going to Senator?
And I apologize, I showed up a little late. But one of the questions that one of the speakers had spoke to, and you zeroed in on the residential piece, but they spoke to like these commercial, like the zoo, the HABC, these scenarios that have been put out to the public, and the pieces not being paid, getting a better understanding of that. That was articulated at the first meeting, and I don't know if we even captured or talked about that at this.
We did capture it, and it is one of the items that will be handled. Remember, meeting 3 is going to be incredible. Early in one of the early slides, it was we specifically listed items from the first meeting that were more appropriately dealt with when we're handling the finances at the 3rd meeting. Okay. With that, I'm going to go back to WSP for the succinct encapsulation of their recommendation, and then I'll be looking to the task force for motions.
I guess I can take this. The recommendation that we have made is that models C, D, and E be passed forward for further study, which means the fiscal analysis As we have discussed here, Model C is the intermunicipal service agreement. Model D is the wholesale service agreement, and Model E is a special district or authority.
Okay, do I have a motion from a member of the task force? Mr. Barr.
Yeah. Mr. Chair, first of all, I've been chomping at the bit for the last hour, but
Your restraint has been admirable, sir.
So noted, right, good. First of all, I want to thank the consultant for all their diligent work as far as narrowing this down to 3. But based on what I've heard tonight, I believe that I would like to make a motion that the task force consider actually narrowing it down to one option that we can pursue diligently, and that would be option E, the special district. I believe that both C and D elements can be incorporated into E, and that's a motion I'd like to put on the table.
There's a second?
Second.
I have a second from Ms. Reed. Is there any discussion?
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that, Mr. Barr. I guess the question I would have is, what's the rationale for going down from the prescribed number to a lower number?
I believe that from what I've heard, at least tonight, things that are included under option C and D, that we discussed or had presented to us under C and D, can be folded into E. That way we can focus our efforts on one option, and we still have a lot of work to do as far as making our proposal to the legislature. So my point is that what I've heard tonight suggests that what we've heard about the governance structures of C and D can be appropriately folded into E. That's my rationale.
Do you have another question?
Sorry, go ahead. I was just double checking that because I saw Neil make a face when you made that, and so I just want to make sure I don't disagree with you, but I just want to make sure we're getting all the accurate information. So I don't know, Neil, if that face was in response to the narrowing, but I just want to make sure we're all in alignment.
Excuse me. My reaction was that C and E are probably not something that can be melded together. They are distinct governance models, and so they are not. You can look at things that you would want to do under C and make sure you are doing them under E, but you cannot govern the same way. It is significantly different to the task force member that asked, distinguish the governance. So in C, it is still city and county working cooperatively. In E, it is a new authority, a new board, kind of starting from scratch and responsible for everything. Now, the city and county would appoint people, to whatever extent the task force or people suggest is the way to distribute the governing votes correctly, but it is substantially different. So those two are very distinct. Wholesale, city does wholesale now. It's just a question of, can you change the relationship with a county to a wholesale one, and does that solve anything?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Ketta and then
So I wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Barr's motion for ruling it down to just 2. I think you said 1. Okay. I think ruling out intermunicipal makes sense. And the rationale to your question, Mr. Davis, from my perspective, having served in the city for 4 years, recruitment, retention, employee issues are very critical, and the governance structure that we should be pursuing is one that can help to resolve those. And if you look at the intermunicipal service agreements, the SWOT analysis for employee recruitment and for retention and training, the weaknesses that have been noted is that there's really no fundamental overhaul of those systems. And I think that's just going to, like I said earlier, it's really the do nothing as far as I'm concerned. As far as D is concerned, wholesale, the city has a wholesale agreement with Howard County. I think that would be interesting to entertain and evaluate what model might work, what wholesale model might work, but it seems to be also more of the same. So that's my rationale, at least for ruling out C.
And I would say that I support what Mr. Barr said from this point of view. If you look at the DC water model, the intermunicipal service agreement existed before it became an independent authority. But as an independent authority, it still operates under an intermunicipal service agreement, as well as has wholesale customers that they treat wastewater for. So that is, why I think what Mr. Barr said makes sense.
Well, and then we'll come to Brian.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're clear, right? Because between Mr. Yosef and Mr. Barr, we got two things. We got one to narrow down to one, and then I heard Mr. Yosef say he wants to support looking at just the two, so narrowing down 3 to 2. And then there was another comment that said this. So I don't have clarity on, because there's a motion on the table to go to just one. Yeah.
It's okay. I mean, this is debate. This is discussion and debate. So this is when you can say, well, you know what? I think we should continue to do all 3. I want to learn more about C. I want to learn more about D. You can just because Mr. Barr's motion is narrowing it down to just one doesn't mean you can't comment with however you feel on it. So I'm going to continue to go to task force members before I come back. This is Ms. Powell.
I have a different hat.
Well, then he had his hand up. Okay.
Yeah.
When you're trying to get my attention for Ms. Powell, yeah, just go like that. I know you've got something for Keisha to say.
She has several comments that I was trying to get in. So Ms. Powell had made a comment that she would appreciate seeing additional utility profiles as part of the discussion around these models, so that's made clear both for the public as they are narrowed as to what may impact governance structures and agreements being appropriate for Baltimore City and Baltimore County. Second comment, she agrees with the motion, which this is a bit asynchronous, so as to which motion. Because C and D are specific types of agreements that will be necessary, and E is a structure that will facilitate the agreement types, as we've somewhat just discussed. Ms. Powell's third comment that I have is that respectfully, she disagrees because DC Water is a special authority that administers an IMA, which Ms. Reed then at about the same time made the same comment. Thank you.
Okay. Delegate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the end, I may very well support going to E, recommending some version of E. I think looking at this material in front of us now, if I had to vote today, as opposed to in December, I would probably vote for E. But I'm not sure I have all the information or have had a chance to digest, the pros and cons of the different models. So for that reason, I would prefer that we not moved at this point to recommending just one model. Thank you.
I'm going to take this opportunity to also chime in and say, kind of in line with what Ms. Powell had mentioned about wanting to know how the other utilities were set up. We had made a point at the first meeting about asking for a wider range of other comparable utilities to be examined. And I think I even said something about, specifically being curious about St. Louis, given that they're the only other city in America that's in quite the same situation that we are. Off the top of your head, which model does St. Louis have?
So I can speak to that just a little bit. St. Louis is a little bit complicated. I would say that, I mean, they have their Metropolitan Sewer District, which covers the entire county. I think that would most aptly be considered an intermunicipal agreement. They also have their St. Louis Water Division for the city itself, which I believe would be the same. The St. Louis County uses American Water, which I believe, what was that? Right, which I think we would consider privatization. So they kind of have like a bifurcated system based off of which utility you're more focused on.
So that's an example of why I'm wondering, and I want to stress, Mr. Barr, I am very sympathetic to your motion, because I do resist the idea of wasting time studying models that we probably won't seriously consider. But at the same time, kind of like what Delegate Stein said, I'm a little worried. Like, we already asked them to go out and look at all of these utilities and look at the comparables, and we haven't even seen yet, which ones are doing, like, we haven't seen a list or a chart of which cities are using which models and are happy about it, or, which ones are using which models and they're experiencing a lot of the same problems we're experiencing now. So maybe we shouldn't try to be emulating them. And I'm just wondering if it's worth narrowing down at this stage even further, when we could ask for that information to be provided to us before the third meeting. Not even necessarily something that has to involve a lengthy presentation, but even just a couple of basic charts to give us a sense of whether, if there are systems somewhere that are doing really well on all the things that we're not, what are they using? Because I would feel that maybe we hadn't done our jobs fully if we ruled out other options and then found out that maybe somebody somewhere is making intermunicipal agreements work, and we just have to figure out what they're doing differently than we are. Maybe somebody is making wholesale purchasing work, and we just need to emulate that. Brian?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I mean, the map that we displayed on the slide was our attempt to distill it into something that is digestible for this format. But I just checked with David, and we have a table that we've prepared. We're preparing this for the report, and it's 10 pages going through all of those dots, that not just dots on a map that we Googled, so we have certainly looked into those and those considerations around how do they set rates, what is their model, et cetera, for those. It's a 10-page table, which obviously we can't put on here, but that could be something that we provide to the task force members, and we post, as part of, everyone doing some reading on their own to become more familiar with those models. I guess I would also suggest the New Gen report also does profile those utilities. Not all of these utilities, because we have added more based on the valuable feedback we received from the task force members. But the New Gen report does profile quite a few of them as well.
Ms. Buckler and then Mr. Moran.
Wanted to chime in a little bit more on the St. Louis system, having had the chance to speak to the head of their wastewater system recently directly. They are a special district in the way that the sewer system is set up for both the city of St. Louis and the county of St. Louis. The water system is privatized by American Water, but their sewer system is a combined sewer system, which is also important to note given our second vote that we have coming up. So their sewer and their stormwater system are combined into one set of pipes for the St. Louis City portion and the immediate area surrounding in the county. Baltimore City, Baltimore County, fortunately, the way that our system was designed, it is not a combined system. So the stormwater is completely separate pipes, separate maintenance from our sewer system. In St. Louis, the combined system is under consent decree because it's a combined system and it causes overflows due to that. So that consent decree is under that special district sewer, I forget exactly what their name is, but it's managed by that for both entities. There isn't a separate one like there is here. Baltimore City is under a separate consent decree from Baltimore County related to our sewer system. Our consent decree is not related to a combined sewer and stormwater system because we don't have that here. So that's something to discuss with the second vote, but why some municipalities, it's combined together and it had to stay combined together in terms of its management.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the second meeting, and the fact that we are going from 5 to possibly 3 different choices, I think, is perfectly fine, given the amount of information we've been given just here in the second meeting. I understand why A, B, and C are not particularly valid choices, given the structure of things and the size of things, but going all of a sudden from those 5 to 1, I think it's rushed and we need more information.
Any other comments? Senator?
I was there with probably getting the 2, but I am going to take the posture of my colleague and think that like having more information.
Okay. Any remaining comments? Okay. All those in favor of the motion, raise your hand and say aye. I'm sorry. There's only one motion on the table. There's the motion Mr. Barr made to narrow the range of models down to just E. And so all those in favor of narrowing down the models to just E, say aye and raise your hand and keep your hand up. Okay. Okay. All right. So as a former legislator, Carla, that's cold. I mean, you seconded the motion. Okay. All right. Okay. All against, say nay. Nay. The motion fails, although I think we all acknowledge it's good intent. Would anyone like to make another motion?
I'd make a motion to go ahead and accept the 3 with the idea that, we likely as we get to number 3, which the chair has rightfully said is going to be the big one, we likely will go lower, get some more information. But I'd recommend I'd make a motion to accept the 3 to continue to study.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second. All right. Any discussion?
Oh, I have just one.
Get it right up there.
Just one comment. Suppose in looking at the profiles of other utilities, we come up with something that's not C, D, or E. How do we handle that?
Well, aside from the fact that I think WSP will look a little red. I mean, I think what would happen is, as we have further conversation, if some model presented itself and there was a consensus that this is a good model and something we should be looking at, but it wasn't C, D, or E, then I guess we would have to discuss opening the consideration back up. I mean, we're empowered to do that. I would say from a practical perspective, since we're telling them by this vote to narrow it down to C, D, and E, my suspicion is they're only going to show us stuff that fits into C, D, and E. So we would have to go out on our own and look for F or G. And yeah, I mean, we got enough work. So any other questions or comments on the motion? Otherwise, oh, I'm sorry, you did, yeah, okay, there we go. All right.
Ms. Powell has seconded the motion.
Okay. Yeah, the technical delays are just part of the fun of a hybrid meeting. Okay, so I'm going to say all those in favor of accepting the recommendation to narrow the models that we're consider to C, D, and E, please raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstaining? Anything from Ms. Powell?
Not yet.
Okay.
I think it's curious.
Okay. Okay, then I'm going to use the discretion of the chair to call the vote and say that this vote has passed, and we will narrow the range of models that we're going to consider to C, D, and E. Before we move on to our second vote, I want to take an opportunity to recognize Councilwoman Odette Ramos from the 14th District of Baltimore City. With the panel's indulgence, we had advertised that public comment was from 8 to 8:45, and she was here in time. And so I would like to ask that she have 2 minutes to address the panel. So, Councilwoman, the microphone is yours. And I mean, I love you and all, but I'm also putting on the stopwatch. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me a couple of minutes. I really do appreciate it. As Mr. Chair said, my name is Odette Ramos. I represent the 14th District in Baltimore City. I know that the chair read our resolution that we passed on Monday, so I'm not going to reread it. I'm just going to emphasize the points that the council has been very clear that this panel should consider. Obviously, stormwater is extremely important. The equity piece is the highest priority because we represent a majority Black and increasingly diverse city that has really bared the brunt of and the burden of the system and in terms of paying for the system and higher water rates for a long time. So that's actually an opportunity that I've always thought would be important as we think about looking at a regional system in terms of the relationship between the county and the city. And then also, whatever format you all are thinking about, I don't know what CD&E is, but I will find out. And making sure that Baltimore City has majority votes on the board. And then last, you know, we as county and city governments, particularly the elected officials, I'm grateful that my colleagues, our senator and our delegate are here, but we really need to be involved because we would have to approve anything that you all come up with. So we will continue to have our oversight hearings and invite you to come to our oversight hearings, but we definitely need to be a part of this process. I actually see this as an opportunity for Baltimore. So we want to make sure that, that we're getting the best opportunity for our city. And so thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'll be trying to come to the other meetings. I apologize that I wasn't here earlier, but I'm grateful that you all are spending so much time on this as well. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman, I want you to know that you hit 1 minute 58.99 seconds. So that's exceptional. Thank you very much. Thank you. While I don't know that I did your resolution justice. I tried to read it with all the gravitas that I could. I channeled the I'm not going to say I channeled you, but I did try a little bit to channel Senator McRae. All right. Thank you. Oh, we have a comment from Ms. Powell.
Just for the record, Ms. Powell has returned her yes vote.
Excellent. All right. The second item that we had agreed to vote on tonight is, as we discussed in greater detail at the first meeting, when this task force was put together, when the legislation was being considered in Annapolis, it appears that stormwater was not addressed. And you can use a variety of terms that have, subtle nuances. Was it considered? To say it wasn't considered implies that nobody even thought about it. We can't know that now, whether anybody thought about it. We just know that it's not in the actual legislation, any reference to stormwater. But the concern that was raised at the first meeting is that, and then I would say the concern that was also repeated by the city council resolution is in so many ways, stormwater is inextricably tied to the other work that we are doing. I've had substantial conversations with both WSP staff and staff of both city and county DPW, and I know that there are a number of very basic administrative and logistical concerns about trying to expand the scope of the task force's work to include stormwater. What I am looking for, and what I am perhaps starting with as a question, is whether there is any room in what WSP is already doing for us to just add the additional information of, do the other utilities that we are looking at, regardless of what model they use, do they address stormwater as part of their model? Just to give us an idea of whether we can be looking to tie future greater regional cooperation around stormwater to whatever governance recommendation we come up with for water and wastewater. I know that in Baltimore City, it would be a non-trivial task to fully and completely separate out water and wastewater from stormwater. I'm not saying it couldn't be done, but I'm not saying it would be easy either. And I think given that reality, any help we could get in determining whether or not that should be something we're worried about and something that should be a consideration in our decision would be appreciated. So I think the way I would frame this motion would be, I'm looking for a motion on wanting to know more about how stormwater is managed by the other governance structures that we're studying in terms of the individual utilities around the country that we've already gathered information on. Would there be a task force member who would be willing to make that motion?
Mr. Chair, I'd make that.
Mr. Barr, is there a second?
No.
Chuck, is a second? Is there any discussion or debate on that motion?
I'm sorry, I should have.
sorry.
Yes, Tim Barr, yes, I made the motion. I apologize, Mr. Chair.
Oh, I got it.
Okay.
Well, Jessica, I think wanted to speak and then you can.
Hi, I just wanted to add on to what you said. If we do pass that, I think it would also be beneficial to note if the water system was a combined sewer system or a separate sewer system.
Could someone talk through what do we have now? And if we didn't, I think the motion is on the table. If that wasn't considered, what would happen with stormwater? I mean, it had to be considered some way. So I'm trying to get a source of truth on if we don't, if the task force doesn't deal with that, what are the implications or what would happen? Because in my mind, I thought they were linked. I didn't think there was any kind of delineation that we could make. So I'm trying to get could you guys speak to that?
I guess specifically is your question with respect to how the stormwater systems work at present within these jurisdictions, or?
Well, I mean, it's gonna work some way, right? So it's not like we can make some policy here, and then somebody's gonna have to deal with the stormwater. So
Right.
I guess I'm trying to figure out in the models that we're debating, is that gonna be a consideration, or does this need to be explicitly stated? That's what I'm trying to get a source of truth on.
Yeah, let me try to unwind that a little bit. You asked the question, what do we have about stormwater? That's zero at this point. To the chair's point of, can we go out and canvass, some of the kind of matching type utilities to find out what they do? It probably can be done. It's just additional effort, whatever that amounts to. I think the logistical challenges are taking and trying to implement or look at the discrete issues associated with stormwater, which are very different than water and sewer, in the same fashion that we're doing for the water and sewer here in the county. So I don't know that have I come close to answering your question, or?
I mean, not really. I guess
Right.
if we pass the motion, the water's going to go somewhere. The water's going to continue to go through those same pipes, right? And so I guess as we think about what the overall structure is going to be, it would seem that it would be something that we want to think about. Or
If I understood the situation, Baltimore City has separate storm and sewers. So it is not to say there isn't any interaction between the two. There may be, but they are separate systems. They have separate building approaches. They have separate issues. They're impacted by separate types of services the city renders. Things like street sweeping. Frequency of street sweeping is a quality issue in stormwater, nothing to do with wastewater. So, it's in principle a third entire asset class in terms of dealing with is, since stormwaters have at their core discharging to streams and flood protection or flood issues, that's clearly a big issue. It doesn't pay attention to geopolitical boundaries. But, as to whether you can deal with it in the sense of, is this the forum to deal with regional concepts for stormwater management? I think you've got to consider that. And that's a big jump.
And I think the big distinction is we talk about stormwater, and there's a distinction, which is the stormwater system. And what, it's easy for us to, when we think about wastewater, inflow and infiltration happens. Inflow is when water that comes from the sky, enters a manhole or another junction, and it becomes part of the wastewater system. That doesn't make the wastewater system a combined sewer or a stormwater system, even though that is what you might say is stormwater of a lowercase s, and infiltration from roots getting into pipes and things like that. So I think that's the thing that you would have to wrestle with is vis-a-vis the charge in the bill, and then is it stormwater? Obviously, anytime that you're looking at a wastewater system, inflow and infiltration exists. There's no 100% tight system.
Yeah, I was going to say, I appreciate your very optimistic and idealized view of our stormwater and sewer systems as completely separate. But I was resisting the urge to put air quotes up there when you were saying separate, as someone who has watched the lack of separate. But there's also, I mean, I think you touched on the other issue to this, which is the fact that there almost certainly is a need for a conversation around regional stormwater management. I know that's not technically what we were told we needed to come together and work on, but we have a lot of the subject matter expertise that we need to have a reasonable public conversation about that. We don't necessarily have all of the data that we would like to have at our fingertips, which would be what this motion would be asking for, more data. But I mean, I kind of want to, I have to admit, I'm taking the approach of we're a team of doctors who have our water and wastewater system on the table, and we're doing some surgery. We went in looking for a particular thing, and we're working on that. But while we're in there, we saw something that we didn't know we were gonna want to address. You could just ignore it, deal with what you want to deal, sew the patient back up, and say that when they heal enough and they're better enough, they could come back in for more surgery, or we could take care of it while we've got the patient open right now. And that's kind of, I have to admit, to the approach I'm suggesting or advocating for. Ms. Buckler, then Delegate. Oh, then we're just going to kind of go down the line here. Okay.
I think there's some engineering nuance here that I don't think is being explained very well. The existing sewer system and stormwater system are two separate sets of pipes. So when you walk down the street and you see a grate next to the curb and it says storm drain, and sometimes stenciled onto it, it says this goes to the Chesapeake Bay. That is all rainwater going into those sets of pipes that eventually makes its way to the Chesapeake Bay. There is a separate set of sewer pipes that connects to everybody's house that when you flush the toilet, it goes into. Those sewer pipes are not connected to that drain you see that says goes to the Chesapeake Bay. But we have aging infrastructure that has been emphasized. So the aging infrastructure, those sewer pipes connected to your house, connected to businesses, is old. And sometimes it means it gets cracks in it, or the joints get separated. And then when it rains or your yard floods, that rainwater gets into the sewer system where it is not supposed to be. So that is the reason, some of the reason in both jurisdictions we're under consent decrees, because we are doing lining projects to line the sewer systems and fix those joint failures. So we do need to address the stormwater that gets into the sewer system. The stormwater that is by itself already going to the Chesapeake Bay, there was a separate task force. I am not an expert in it. Dr. Summers may be able to say more about it, that MDE was running with all the jurisdictions. I know Baltimore County was actively participating in that task force through our Department of Environmental Protection and Sustainability. I believe those recommendations are out for comments, and that is supposed to be regional approach and changes to flooding and stormwater management statewide, and had the expertise in that task force related to all the jurisdictions.
So I don't know if Dr. Summer can say more about that because I'm not an expert on it. I just know it was happening.
Yes, it's called a storm, and it has to do with advancing stormwater resiliency in Maryland. And as has been pointed out by the council, there are flooding issues. There are all kinds of problems with stormwater. We are a water and wastewater task force, and stormwater affects both water and wastewater. We've just heard about how it affects wastewater. It affects stormwater because all of the watersheds that we rely upon for our water supply in the counties and parts of the city are affected by stormwater runoff. So when I look back at our 1974 agreement, almost 50 years ago, it's got a provision on stormwater in it, which deals with the jurisdictions making sure stormwater doesn't get illegally discharged into the system. It's also got provisions in it for plus 15% for infiltration in determining sewage flow. So 50 years ago, they understood that. We're putting an agreement presumably in place or a governance structure that's going to be around for a few years. Hopefully not 50, because I think things will change a lot more by then. But I am not arguing that we should try to incorporate every aspect of stormwater into our deliberations here. But I believe we should. I think one of the governance models we had, Cape Fear, created a framework with principles. And I would submit that our principles that come out in our recommendation should say things about addressing stormwater. The stormwater from Baltimore County running off of state and local highways delivers salt to our reservoirs at levels that exceed safe drinking water secondary standards. Our reservoirs are becoming more and more salty due to stormwater. The same thing is going on across the US, and WSSC is struggling to address this in their reservoirs in Patuxent. So I think we need to consider stormwater in our deliberations. I would like to know more about how other jurisdictions are handling this. But I know how complex the stormwater issue is, and I don't think we need to address every little bit of it with our governance recommendation. But I do think we need to talk about it and make sure it's in the front of mind of the folks who wind up running our system, because it affects both the quality of our drinking water and it affects the sewer overflow situation and the quality of our receiving waters.
Thank you, Dr. Delegate.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to follow on Dr. Summers, very eloquent and of course former MDE secretary. I guess, Mr. Chairman, if your resolution is one of data collection and potentially reporting on what many systems do with respect to stormwater, and that in turn leads to, as Dr. Summers said, perhaps a recommendation that with respect to principles of stormwater, that whatever governance model we recommend take into account those or consider those principles, I would be fine with that and would vote in favor of it. However, I think given the stage of the process we're already in, I would not support the resolution if it would mean that we're going to be recommending a governance system that includes stormwater. You know, our charge under the law is water and wastewater. Those are the joint utilities that the city and county currently operate. Stormwater is treated, there's no interaction between the county and the city on stormwater now. The systems are different. The state issues the permits to each jurisdiction independently under their MS4 permit. So I would certainly think that even if we're just at the point of information gathering, MDE should be consulted as the permit authority. So I guess I just wanted to say that if your resolution would suggest, would require data gathering, consideration of that data leading to principles that on stormwater that we would suggest that the authority consider, I would be fine with that. But I would resist it if it says the governance mechanism we're recommending applies not just to water and wastewater, but also to stormwater.
So I will say in quick response that I'm a big believer in dealing with October's problems in October and November and December's problems in November and December. Right now, my motion is just about trying to gather information. What we eventually do in terms of a recommendation is that's down the line. And we have a lot of other stuff to talk about before we get to there. Ms. Reed.
Some eloquent points have been made, and I don't say that I disagree with them. And, you know, I don't know whether the question is, could we study stormwater or could we look at more information? Yes. Should we? I'm not as sure. And I say that because, you know, I really don't understand how the House bills work. That was specific. It said something that required us to do something, and it didn't include stormwater. But now we're doing whatever, whether it's little thing or big thing, we're doing something regarding stormwater. And I don't know how I feel about doing that without going back to the entities that made this bill.
Mr. Chair.
We'll come to no, Mr. Cabetta, you're next.
Okay. Yeah, I think the fine points raised about the you know, including stormwater. My only concern is what Mr. Callahan mentioned earlier about the level of effort and potential for distracting us from the mission at hand.
Ms. Powell?
Yeah, so Ms. Powell has made a point. She has pointed out a document that is on the Baltimore County Department of Environmental Protection and Sustainability website and offered some context, which is that in 2002 and then subsequently updated in 2006, there was a regional watershed management agreement between the county and the city, which speaks to stormwater, and that perhaps this should be the basis of future work to consider the governance of this agreement. And subsequently to Ms. Buckler's comment, Ms. Powell stated that what Ms. Buckler just referenced is what started in 2002 when Baltimore City and Baltimore County, working with the state, codified a regional approach to watershed management.
Mr. Barr?
Mr. Chair, I do have a question for the consultant. If we do proceed, if your motion goes through and we do collect this additional information, I think it would be very appropriate, as I said earlier, Mr. Summers said earlier, to at least incorporate some concepts. A question I have for the consultant is that, will that jeopardize our schedule as far as getting our work done on time? Is that an issue, or is that even an issue? Sure. If we just do some.
Sure.
Okay, can you address that, please?
Surely. I guess first off, you know, as far as what is the consultant's scope, you know, in speaking to utilities, it's natural for us to ask, do you provide drinking water service? Do you provide wastewater service? Do you provide stormwater service? that's natural and that's part of the scope, of speaking to a utility. That would be as far as our scope covers us to address stormwater. So anything else that would have to be addressed related to, not, and again, we're not talking about inflow and infiltration. That's part of a wastewater utility, as you know. But to talk about a stormwater utility or different approaches to stormwater, none of that, is within our scope at this time. So if there were additional, we have collected the information about the utilities that we spoke to about what services they provide. So drinking water, wastewater, or stormwater. If the committee needs additional information as it's related to stormwater, prior to a subsequent vote, then that would take time to prepare those materials and effort in order to get that together. And I guess it would be an outcome of your decision as a task force as to what information you feel you need before any perhaps final model is selected.
So I will say, just in quick response to Mr. Barr, I don't think having this affect the task force's schedule is an option.
Okay.
I mean, we have to do what we have to do when we have to do it by.
Agreed. Okay.
Whether, and also, I guess, addressing Ms. Reed's concerns. Now, I admit, I've never been on a state mandated task force before, but the language of the legislation very clearly articulated what we needed to do. I saw no language in the legislation preventing us or prohibiting us from doing other things. It's just, you got to do this and you got to get it done by then. If we can get other stuff done, I mean, we're just delivering recommendations. Other people are going to make this happen or not. So if we choose to add on a little, oh man, there's a word. It's Lanapy, like it's in New Orleans, when they add a little something extra onto the food. It's spelled Lagnapy or something like that, but all right, okay. Anyway, it's like if we want to add a little extra policy something, a little extra, yeah, a little something. All right, if we wanted to add that on, I don't think that we're breaking any rules doing so. What is a legitimate issue is the consultants had a contract to do a certain set of work. And if they can't do additional work even when we're requesting it, that's a potential problem. And I have not read their contract with the level of scrutiny that I read the House bill, because the House bill is much shorter than the contract for WSP. And I don't know if WSP's contract has somewhere buried in it a little other duties as required kind of clause where we can come up with stuff and say, and we need this. And WSP says, well, if you want to do this, then we're going to have to either take that out or have someone extra come around and do this. And maybe that's also going to cost you a little extra. And if this all ends up boiling down to money, then I probably have to have an offline conversation with people who have more money than I have. But for right now, I'd like to just focus on taking the temperature of the task force and finding out what do we want to do. If it turns out later we can't do what we want to do, that's another issue. But apparently it's hard to even ask if we don't say that we want it. So I think Dr. Summers had another.
Well, I was just going to say all the utilities that you're dealing with that provide drinking water are familiar with source water protection. And I don't know what kind of provisions they've put in. A lot of the source water protection analyses are quite old and have not been updated. But I think given all the changes that we're seeing now in the intensity and duration of storm events, emerging contaminants of concern, I think it would be a disservice to the future residents for us not to at least take a look at how that's being handled. And I would make some recommendation.
Any additional comments or questions? Seeing none, we have a motion on the table. Do we need to have it repeated before we vote? Okay, the motion on the table is that we will ask the consultants to provide information on how the different utilities that they are already studying for models C, D, and E address, sorry, stormwater. That is the motion on the table. Before we take a vote, we will recognize Ms. Powell.
Ms. Powell has offered this comment. A framework for regional watershed management exists, but establishing the governance of that framework is not in the scope of this task force. I would not be opposed to laying out principles as suggested by Dr. Summers, but there is a significant amount of ground to cover with just water and wastewater alone.
Okay. All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hands and say aye. Aye. 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7. Any opposed? Raise your hands and say nay.
Nay.
All right, I see a vote of 7-4, so I'm going to say that the vote passes, and we will ask the consultants to put together that information. Yes, I see Mr. Luna raising his hands, both hands wide, to show that we do not have 10 votes. But as I said, having specifically read the House bill, 10 votes are required for the commission to make a final recommendation. For other business of the commission during the course of its deliberations and discussions, there was no mention of a supermajority of votes required for regular business. And so the chair is saying that 7 people saying yes and 4 people saying no means we'd like to do it. So we will ask, Delegate Stein.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but and I don't know if in the council there is the process of explaining one's vote as
Certainly.
there's no legislature, but I just want to explain my vote is yes, subject to the discussion that we've had, that it would be information gathering, the purpose of potentially making recommendations on the framework, but not with respect to stormwater governance. So in that spirit, I vote yes.
Mr. Chair,
Senator?
only because the discussion went on for 25 minutes, I just wanted to make sure that I was recorded as a yes vote with the thing. It's information gathering, so as long as from a recommendation standpoint, it didn't sound like that was the direction that we were going, I don't mind information gathering.
Correct. Thank you.
Put me on the record.
So just make sure that the record reflects that both the senator and the delegate are in favor of additional information gathering, as are the rest of us who voted in favor of the motion. Dr. Mitchell.
Yes, just so I'm understanding that the motion on the table is just for information gathering. I thought I heard something a little bit more nuanced, but if it's that, then my vote is okay.
Okay. Maybe we should, just to be safe, take that vote again, as it's and clear that this is a motion to ask the consultants to provide information for the utilities that they are already studying for model C, D, and E in regards to how those utilities deal with stormwater. And those who are in favor of that, of making that request, please raise your hands and keep them up. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so we don't even have to have the confusion over whether the House Bill's supermajority for the final recommendation applies or not. Well, first of all, I want to thank the task force for your dedication to talking all of these issues through. We have exceeded the time span that we had intended to spend on this, but I appreciate your willingness to, keep doing until the work is done, because that is pretty much what we signed up for when we agreed to do a big pot of work in like almost no time. Ms. Powell.
For the record, Ms. Powell also votes yes.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So we are done with the votes. Do we have anything that we need to announce other than maybe throwing the slide back up for the third task force meeting? Our next public meeting will be on Wednesday, the 18th, from 6 to 9, hopefully, at Community College of Baltimore County, Essex campus, Robert and Eleanor Ramadka College Center, upper level lobby. Please feel free to park in lot 1 between Iota and Zeta. I'm sure there's a good sorority joke there, but I can't pull it off at the top of my head. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and we look forward to engaging you again in 2 weeks. Thank you.
All right. That's right. Yeah.